Hello and welcome back to the horror of video games. Today I'm talking about that feeling of power in horror games. Now what I mean by this is how weapons make the player feel in horror games. For example, in Resident Evil Remake, if you're playing as Chris, my favourite character, on hard difficulty, up until the point you get the shotgun in that game, you feel vulnerable, you feel weak. It's when you get the shotgun, you feel this amazing sense of power and reassurance when you get the shotgun. You take it off the wall and you can dispatch enemies very quickly with the headshots and you feel powerful. And the same thing applies with Resident Evil 4. Now, I know automatic weapons featured in other Resident Evil games after the first one, but the TMP in Resident Evil 4, the same feeling of power happens. I mean, it's an incredible feeling that you can just mow down enemies at a distance. You can mow down multiple enemies at once. I mean, the difference between that and what you can do in Remake, where you're fighting maybe one or two enemies at the same time. In Resident Evil 4, you can take on a whole crowd of enemies simultaneously, and that is just, I mean, astonishing, the difference between the two games with the TMP. And this feeling of power just magnifies itself as the game develops. As you make the TMP ever more powerful, you give it a bigger capacity magazine, you have more powerful bullets, faster reload time, you put the stock on the TMP. It really is incredible. Out of all the guns in Resident Evil 4, I think the TMP has to be my favourite one. Just for crowd control purposes, I just wanted to point out that this feeling of strength, this feeling of power is also very similar to when you get the shotgun in Remake. And I think also horror games do this very well, especially in, say, Dead Space 2, which provides you with rather interesting weaponry, or Doom 3, and, you know, as you get more and more weaponry, it changes the player's relationship with the game and the enemies in this game, and it's like the player becomes progressively more powerful as the game develops, especially in Resident Evil 4, where you're boosting your weapons every so often. And what I wanted to point out is that what I said in Remake is that the game gets progressively easier because of problems with the control scheme, how it's the control scheme which limits ultimately how difficult Resident Evil Remake becomes. However, in Resident Evil 4, what happens is that your guns become more powerful and more capable, but what happens is the game limits the amount of ammunition you have to kind of counterbalance your powerful weaponry, because what you'll find in that game is that you may have very powerful weapons, but you have very little ammunition. So this is how Resident Evil 4 counteracts this problem. And then also the control schemes in Resident Evil 4 is vastly superior to Remake, and it allows more interesting boss battles, it allows more complex enemy movement. Now, for example, when these kind of flying insect-like enemies appear, I feel like the difficulty of the game dramatically increases after this point with flying enemies, and this kind of thing was not possible with Remake, these kind of complex enemy movements, enemies flying around, and these things were just not possible in Remake. But in Resident Evil 4 you have great aiming controls. But what you actually notice about Resident Evil 4 is that it still has tank controls. I mean, I remember watching a video, it showed a third-person view of Leon walking around the game, and I think it proves that tank controls still exist in Resident Evil 4. I might be wrong on this, but I remember watching a video about this, and, you know, tank controls are still present in Resident Evil 4, but they're just done better to give this kind of illusion of freedom of movement. And generally speaking, I'd say Resident Evil 4 is a far more forgiving game than Remake. You don't have to find ink ribbons for typewriters. The game frequently gives you checkpoints and saves the game for you for free. You don't need to have special items to save your game. And I think this helps the flow of the game, and it also makes it a bit more friendly to other players. I think my interest with the weaponry used in horror games is the relationship between the player progressing through the game, the player getting new weaponry, that weaponry becomes more powerful, and the enemies become more powerful, and how that affects the relationship between player and enemies within horror games. Now, you would think that with any kind of game, as you go through the game, you get better weapons, and you would normally think that the game would become easier as a result, but I feel this is very clever game design by these game designers, how you are becoming progressively more powerful, but also the enemies are becoming more powerful as well to match this progression, rather than just you get to the end and you're just steamrolling all the way through the game. I think this is very, very clever game design, and this is demonstrated in a spectrum of horror games, that they just kind of counteract weaponry with tougher enemies and more complex enemies, and like I said in Resident Evil 4, they limit the amount of ammunition you have. I mean, I always felt like I was running out of TMP ammunition, for example. The game just doesn't give you plentiful ammunition, which is fantastic. This is how survival horror should be. There should be limited resources, there should be limited numbers of bullets and grenades and etc. I think this is what survival horror is all about, and I think how Resident Evil 4 does this is fantastic. Okay, so that's the end of the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to comment, rate and subscribe. You can tweet me at the Horror of VG. I'll see you next time.